We just gained another 1,000 new subscribers and therefore it's time to talk about another favorite classic movie of mine. And since we crossed the magical mark of 10,000 subscribers, I thought it should be a special pick. So why not talk about one of the best German films ever made, the one I always recommend when people ask me about great movies from the country I'm from. Today we will dive deep into Wolfgang Petersen's Das Boot. Servus Freunde, my name is Jimmy Cage and Das Boot is probably the most famous German film outside of Germany, but it is definitely not a typical German movie. As a matter of fact, it is often regarded as an American movie because of its high emphasis on tense, special effects driven spectacle. At the time of its release it was the most expensive movie that ever came out of Germany, and its claustrophobic submarine scenes as well as the big action set pieces still hold up. But the film is much more than just a showcase of impressive immersive special effects. It's driven by amazing performances by a big cast, and it's much more a psychological anti-war movie than a glorious action thriller. It is set in 1941 during the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, and it tells the story of the crew of the U-boat U-96. The German logline on the poster was eine Reise ans Ende des Verstandes, a journey to the end of the mind. And what a journey it is. A journey that will bring you the terror and madness and also the boredom and filth of what it must have been to live and work and fight in a U-boat in one of history's darkest times. It is a film from the perspective of German soldiers, meaning soldiers who fight for Nazi Germany, a circumstance that was heavily criticized when the film was first released, but surprisingly largely by German critics who downright rejected the film, while it turned out to be praised internationally. Yes, it is told from a German perspective, but it does show that not every soldier was a glowing National Socialist. The film does portray a few who are loyal to the Nazi ideology, but it does also portray just normal, common men of the time. It is told so hauntingly, so authentic and gripping, that it goes far beyond simple good versus evil or Allied versus German distinctions. It's a film about war and what it does to the human condition, how it is crushing the soul and how everyone in it has to suffer. It is a film about survival, also adventure, human drama, and it's one of the most remarkable war movies ever made. The first attribute that comes to mind when thinking about Das Boot must be authenticity, because everything about it, minus a few things for dramatization, has been done in a way that guarantees the most realistic portrayal of what it must have been like. It is based on the best-selling 1973 autobiographical book of the same name by Lothar Günther Buchheim. Buchheim was Kriegsberichterstatter, war reporter, and served on many ships in the German Marine. So he wrote from his personal experiences. For many years the Bavaria studio tried to adapt his story for the big screen, but they wanted to make it an American production because there seemed to be no other way to realize such a big project, because those simply weren't done in Germany at that time. At one point John Sturges with lead actor Robert Redford, at another Don Siegel with Paul Newman were in talks to do it, but without results. It was producer Günther Rohrbach who was a significant player in making the film possible that we see today. In the 70s he had the idea of the so-called amphibious film, meaning stories and films that work in the cinema as well as on TV. Movies in Germany were dependent on money from the big public TV stations, but those stations didn't really get much out of it, and Rohrbach's concept was to make them equal partners. When he became the new studio boss of Bavaria, Das Boot really began its journey. Immediately Rohrbach thought about his longtime colleague Wolfgang Petersen, who has been very anxious to do Das Boot himself for a long time at that point. You have to realize that while the Americans were still involved, there was already significant work done on the production. They have built a giant reconstruction of a German U-boat down to the very detail. But one significant thing they did was among the first that Petersen changed once he was in charge of the production. The set of the boat had been opened up along one side so that the camera crew had easy access to film what was happening inside. But this was not in line with Petersen's vision. He wanted to create the most authentic atmosphere possible, and pretty much all submarine films from the past showed rather spacious interiors, which is the opposite from what it actually was like in such a tight surrounding that was also filled with a big crew who constantly changed shifts. There were more men on board than beds for the crew, because when one man was going to sleep, the one occupying the bed at that moment went up to work his shift. In order to be able to film in those narrow corridors, to be as close as possible at any given moment, to capture their daily lives down in that sub, director of cinematography Joost Vacano had to use his very own system. Not exactly a Steadicam, but similar. And the cinematography is one of the most impressive things about Das Boot. Since they have built an almost exact duplication of a real boat, you could walk through the entire thing, and there are many moments where we follow crew members around in long continuous shots that let you be part of this world as well. And it's one of those cases where it's such a fascinating, immersive world that invites you to spend time in it, and at the same time you are very happy that you don't actually have to be on such a boat. Apart from the whole war aspect, of course. In the following years, Joost Vacano became a regular collaborator of Paul Verhoeven, and he did the camera work for films like RoboCop, Total Recall and Starship Troopers. Now, as I've said, Das Boot was meant to be on the big screen as well as on the small TV screen, and this meant that Petersen had to make a theatrical version, but also a much longer adaptation for the TV, where it was intended to air as a mini-series with several episodes. Petersen not only directed the film, but also wrote the screenplay, based on the book by Buchheim. And when asked about his workflow, he always says that he was basically writing the film version with his right hand, while simultaneously writing the TV one with his left. And he always jokes that the producers would have liked it to be the other way around, because the money came from all the different TV agreements after all. But Petersen always had the bigger picture in mind, the cinematic effect. The original theatrical cut of the film was 2.5 hours long, and it premiered in 1981. The TV version aired a few years later, and its running time was pretty much exactly twice as long. It was 5 hours long, separated into several episodes, and you can imagine that there was a ton of stuff that was missing from the theatrical version. Well, that one was much faster paced with heavy emphasis on the action parts. The TV version could explore in much more detail the daily life on the submarine, show you more about the different characters and what's on their minds. When the film hit the big screen, it was mostly rejected by German critics. Not only did they thought it was wrong to portray German soldiers in a favorable light, they also criticized the characters not being developed enough and marginalized in favor of a more plot and action-oriented narrative. Which is kind of true, but this was a very European versus American cinema discussion. Two very different kinds of filmmaking and storytelling, and Das Boot was supposedly trying too hard to copy American blockbuster cinema. The budget was criticized a lot as well, because with around 31 million Deutsche Mark, or converted 15 million US dollars, it was a huge sum at the time, the most expensive German production to that date, for which many smaller films could have been produced. One of the biggest critics was the author of the book himself. Lothar Günther Buchheim called it a Salzwasser-Western, a saltwater western, which to be honest I think is quite the awesome description, but of course he meant it in a demeaning way. I assume the film was not historically accurate enough for him, which is baffling because realism is one of its biggest triumphs, but at the same time understandable because Buchheim lived through it for real, and of course he has another, way more critical perspective on it. Even though the film was very popular with audiences, all of the criticism resulted in West Germany not even submitting the film as their official Oscar candidate. Instead they chose Rainer Werner Fassbinder's Lili Marleen, which I have yet to see, but I think is also an incredible film. But it didn't get nominated. Das Boot, on the other hand, got nominated a year later for 6 regular categories after it had been released in the US. Wolfgang Petersen himself got 2 nominations as Best Director and for Best Adapted Screenplay, Joost Vacano for Best Cinematography, Hannes Nickel for Best Editing, as well as nominations for Best Sound and Best Effects/Sound Effects Editing. To this day, it is still the most successful German movie at the American box office with almost $12 million. Now, you might wonder which version you should watch, the tight 2.5 hour long theatrical or the 5 hour long TV version. The answer is neither. In the mid-90s, Wolfgang Petersen, who at that time has been living in the US for many years, returned to his most famous movie and created the best of both worlds, his director's cut, which is the perfect combination of the theatrical cut and the TV version. It cost $2.5 million because they didn't simply cut both versions together, but also created a whole new sound design. The original sound was state-of-the-art in the early 80s, and it was even nominated for 2 Oscars, but for the new version they took the original German dialogue, by the way, watch it in German with subtitles, and they rearranged it with new sounds for everything else, and the result creates an even more nightmarish, tormenting atmosphere. The motto was again, realism above all, and all the sounds in that U-boat, all the cracking, all the water breaking in, all the bolts getting loose under the immense pressure, it all sounds incredible. So definitely go with the director's cut, because it gives you all the action plus all the characters. It is quite long, but it only underlines the true nature of those long missions, where most of the time absolutely nothing happens and you still have to pass the time and be prepared for anything at all times. The long runtime also makes you understand better how the people on board are changing, both physically and mentally. The crew that enters isn't the same that leaves. In the words of the captain, they grow beards. But of course it's more. They become paler, their skin gets worse, the food is terrible and so is the thin air and of course the hygienic conditions. But the biggest toll comes in those tense moments when you are threatened to get destroyed by an enemy ship. The mission of U-96 is to destroy as many carrier ships on the Atlantic as possible to weaken England's supply lines. But the Allies were constantly working on new techniques to spot the German U-boats, and around 1941 the tide was already turning. At the beginning of the film, a small text lets you know that of 40,000 German U-boat sailors, 30,000 never returned, which is the highest death ratio of any military department in the war. When the film first had its premiere in America, the audience was cheering and applauding when this information came up on screen. Which is understandable because the Germans were the enemy, and this number meant that the Allies were very effective in stopping them from winning the war. A war they brought onto the world. Of course, director Petersen was very afraid how those people would receive the film, but over the course of the next hours the movie was able to capture them with its fine portrayal of those soldiers in war and with its universal depiction of human beings in terrible circumstances. And speaking about that crew, we need to address the incredible acting by everyone and the direction by Petersen. This is one of those films that features a long list of well-known faces, but faces who at that time were completely new and fresh. The only known actor at that time was Jürgen Prochnow, who plays the lead role of the captain. He is the anchor of the whole operation, Herr Kaloin, or simply Der Alte, the old one everybody's looking up to. And Prochnow, who like Petersen went to Hollywood after the success of the movie, brings the presence to pull it off at all times. He brings a warmth and likability to the role, while also staying this fierce, disciplined military leader who won't tolerate anyone in his crew losing their nerves. The second most important part is played by none other than Herbert Grönemeyer, who became one of Germany's most beloved musicians in the following years, and today nobody really thinks about films when they hear the name Grönemeyer. He plays Lieutenant Werner, the young war correspondent who's assigned to join the crew of U-96 and report from the war front. This character is basically the alter ego of Buchlein, the author of the book. We don't really get to learn that much about him or his past, but this character functions much more as a direct link to the audience. Werner is us joining the world of the submarine. Through his eyes and through his reactions, we are getting introduced to the mechanisms of the boat and the camaraderie of the crew. Among that crew are a lot of people who became really famous later on, at least in Germany. Names like Martin Semmelrogge, Heinz Hönig, Uwe Ochsenknecht, Claude Oliver Rudolph, Ralf Richter and more. And the longer director's cut gives you much more insight into their personalities. Not that we really get to know most of them on a personal level, but the time we spend with them adds a lot to the realistic feeling the film is oozing at any given time. Das Boot is a showcase of what you can achieve if all the elements are working together, and Petersen's direction is marvelous. It's also a perfect example of how much it contributes if you create the right surroundings for your shooting. It's not just a perfectly realized reconstruction of a German submarine for the audience, but it also helped the actors tremendously to get into the right mindset and atmosphere to then deliver the performances needed to make it all come to life. This isn't just people standing before a green screen, this is people reacting to what's really around them, at least kind of. In the most tense moments when the crew could be killed at any second because of all those water bombs exploding around the boat, there was someone of the film crew outside of the set wielding a big sledgehammer and hammering it against the hull of the construction, so that the people inside really felt the impact. The whole set could also be completely turned and shaken around. combined with great special effects that could blow up stuff in the inside, let loose steam, light fire and so on. It all comes together in one of the most immersive war movie experiences. A special mention must also go to the makeup, which only highlights the amazing performances even more. To look into those frightened, pale faces with eyes that haven't slept in days, faces of people who are under constant pressure. Pressure that we can hardly imagine in today's day and age. And last but certainly not least, Das Boot features an iconic score by composer Klaus Doldinger that brings the right tunes for the right times and moods. Das Boot is adventure, Das Boot is survival, Das Boot is drama, and Doldinger's score underlines all of that. So in German I'd say, das war nun eine echt lange Kritik, aber es ist auch ein echt langer Film, der es aber unbedingt wert ist, gesehen zu werden. Er gibt einen der eindrucksvollsten und beklemmendsten Einblicke in die schreckliche Wirklichkeit des Krieges. Und er macht dies auf solch eine realistische Art und Weise, dass man sich fast selbst in dem kleinen, engen, schmutzigen U-Boot zu befinden glaubt. I give Das Boot 9 out of 10. It's more like 8.7, but I don't do that.
Diesmal erwischen sie uns nicht! Diesmal nicht! Heut durch, verdammt nochmal! Heut durch!
Alright, that's it. Like always, comment below and let me know what you think about Das Boot. And also let me know what is your favorite submarine movie. If you know this movie, I think it will be it. You can hit me up on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram simply at the Jimmy Cage. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give me a thumbs up, share, subscribe, whatever you like. And make sure you hit that bell for all I have to tell.